Imagine for a moment waking up in a world where light no longer exists. You open your eyes and realize there is no dawn, no gentle promise of the sun breaking through the curtains, no whisper of the morning illuminated wind. There is only darkness, a darkness so dense and suffocating that it feels heavy, as if pressing down on your chest and your soul at the same time. It is at this initial point that your mind begins to wonder, what happened to the sky, to the natural order of things, to the eternal cycle that seemed immutable? This is not just a scene from a nightmare. It is the image of an omen, a fragment of what Nostradamus, the enigmatic 16th century prophet, described in his visions. And perhaps the most disturbing thing is not the idea of eternal night, but the possibility that it is closer than we imagine. In the first moments of this endless night, humanity reveals its fragility. The streets cease to be paths and become abysses where screams echo like ghosts. Sirens, meant to protect, become the sound of collective despair. Families cling to one another, unsure if the darkness is merely the absence of light or if something greater, something invisible, lurks within. Our senses, accustomed to relying on clarity, lose their bearings. Our eyes cannot see, our ears become confused, and even our hearts seem to race as if sensing a danger yet to be named. What would happen to a society that suddenly loses its most basic guide, light? It is in this scenario that the figure of Nostradamus emerges, not as a simple writer of riddles, but as an ancient shadow that insists on dialoguing with the present. He didn't speak in a straight line. He didn't describe the future as a closed book, but as a mirror cracked into multiple reflections. For him, time was not a road, but a spiral that repeats in different forms, the same trials, the same falls, the same revelations. When he writes about the darkness spreading across the world, it's not just about the night that covers the sky, it's about the night that inhabits the human soul. And here a disturbing question arises. What if the prophecy is not just a warning about a cosmic event, but also about us? What if the true darkness is not physical, but spiritual? With each generation, Nostradamus seemed to see signs of decay, of civilizations forgetting their roots, of men exchanging wisdom for arrogance. Perhaps the 3 days of darkness are not just days marked on the astronomical calendar, but symbols of an inner immersion, a period in which humanity would be forced to face its own monsters. But the mystery deepens. Nostradamus didn't limit himself to portraying darkness as absence. He implied that something dwells within it, something that moves when the light goes out, something that stalks those who dare to look out the window, ignoring the warning that certain secrets are not meant for human eyes. This raises another question. Why do so many traditions from different cultures and eras speak of not directly contemplating the darkness? What could exist outside that should not be seen? The answer remains hidden, and perhaps the danger lies precisely in trying to find it. Now imagine the psychological impact of this experience. Days without sunlight would be enough to shake any social structure. How can order be maintained when the human mind, accustomed to cycles of light and shadow, loses its bearings? Modern scientists confirm that prolonged absence of light alters not only the body, but also the mind, leading to states of delirium, anxiety, and even madness. Nostradamus, in his veiled language, seemed to anticipate this instability, as if he knew that we face not only the darkness of the sky, but also the darkness of consciousness. And yet, he doesn't write as a man of fear. He writes as someone who announces, who holds a mirror up to humanity and asks, "Are you ready?" Because the real shock may not be the arrival of darkness, but what it will reveal about who we truly are when the light fades. Darkness is a test, a passage, and like every omen, it carries both threat and promise. If the idea of 3 days of darkness seems frightening today, Imagine how it sounded in centuries past, when the heavens were the language of the gods, and each eclipse was seen as a sign of judgment. Nostradamus drew from this source, interpreting the sky as a book where each star was a word, and each planetary movement a sentence written for those with attentive eyes. The question is, do we still know how to read this book? Or have we become blind, trusting only in the artificial brilliance of our own inventions? This first vision of waking up in a world without light is more than a frightening image. It's a key that opens the door to profound reflections on our collective destiny. And here arises a conflict that cannot be ignored. If the prophecy is literal, how will we survive the absence of sunlight? If it is symbolic, what kind of transformation does it demand of us? Which of the two answers is more disturbing? Perhaps the metaphor is more devastating than the suit. However, this is not the only layer of revelation. Nostradamus confronts us with a paradox. Eternal night can be both the end and the beginning. The end of an old and corrupt cycle, the beginning of a new, cleaner, more lucid era. The problem is that all renewal requires sacrifice, and not everyone will be able to cross the abyss. This is the price inscribed in spiraling time. That which is not purified repeats itself. And so, the first part of this journey ends with an image that insists on remaining in the mind. The world plunged into darkness, panicked crowds, and a prophecy that spans the centuries to remind us that the sun is not guaranteed, that light is not eternal, and that darkness, whether of the sky or of the soul, always returns. But before we continue, we must face an even more disturbing question. Who was the man capable of envisioning this destiny and transforming it into verses that stand the test of time? Nostradamus is not just a name in ancient books. He is the shadow that guides this narrative, and to know his life is to understand why his words still resonate as if written for us, here and now. Nostradamus, a name that spans the centuries like a whisper among shadows, simultaneously arousing fascination and fear. When we speak of him, we are not just talking about a historical figure, but a symbol, a man who walked between two shores, science and mystery, the visible and the invisible, logic and omen. For some, he was simply a physician attentive to the ills of the human body. For others, an astrologer who read the heavens as if deciphering a secret letter sent by the gods. But for many, Nostradamus was the seer who dared to write about the future as if he had already lived it. He was born in 1503, in a France still marked by conflict, plagues, and transformations. Life at that time was unstable, fragile, and death loomed large every day like an unwelcome visitor. Imagine living in a world where the Black Death still echoed in memories, where medicine balanced between rudimentary remedies and superstition, and where the night sky was seen as the greatest book of revelations. It was in this context that Michel de Nostradamus grew up. A young man who learned early on that reality wasn't limited to what met the eye. Perhaps it was this atmosphere of uncertainty that fostered in him a rare sensitivity to see beyond. Nostradamus wasn't content with simply being a doctor. Though he studied and practiced medicine with dedication, he was capable of dealing with diseases and epidemics. But his curiosity went beyond the physical body. He spent entire nights observing the stars, delving into calculations, searching for hidden patterns in the heavens. For him, the movement of the planets was not only beautiful, but also carried signs about human life, as if destiny were engraved in space, and the cosmos were a great cosmic clock, ready to announce each change of era. But here arises a question that touches us directly. Why did someone who could have pursued a solid career as a doctor choose to venture into the path of symbols, enigmas, and prophecies? Perhaps because he realized that the human body can get sick, but the human spirit insists on seeking deeper answers, and this is what connects Nostradamus to our daily lives. Think about how often, even living in a technological and rational world, you look to the sky for answers. How many times have you sought coincidences, signs, or even dreamed of something that seemed to foreshadow an event? Nostradamus transformed this human impulse into a method, into verses, into prophecies. His famous quatrains, those short four-line poems, became the hallmark of his work. Written in enigmatic language, blending Old French, Latin, and even invented expressions, they seem more like riddles than predictions. But it is precisely this ambiguity that gives strength to his legacy. Because each generation reads the verses and finds in them reflections of its own crisis, its own darkness. And herein lies the great surprise. Nostradamus never wrote solely for his time. He wrote for the cycle, for the spiral of destiny that repeats itself. What he saw in the 16th century was not exclusive to his era, but fragments of eternal patterns that return, changing only their setting, their form, their mask. This detail, the vision of time as a spiral, is perhaps his most enigmatic contribution. Instead of imagining the future as a straight path that advances without return, Nostradamus saw time as a circular movement where the same lessons return until they are understood. This affects us directly. How often do you notice that certain mistakes repeat themselves in your life? That certain events seem to come in cycles, bringing back lessons that were not learned? It's the same logic on a larger scale. Empires rise and fall, wars begin and begin again, and humanity insists on facing the same dilemmas under new guises. Nostradamus simply put this into words, as if writing an echo of destiny. But if his verses are so cryptic, why does the name Nostradamus still have such an impact today? Because among hundreds of omens, some seem to have come true in disturbing ways. Some point to his words as predicting the rise of Napoleon, Hitler, the French Revolution, and the Great World Wars. Each interpretation sparks intense debate, and critics claim it's all just coincidence or a forced interpretation. However, even coincidences force us to reflect. What if it's not a coincidence? What if there really is a hidden order, a cosmic script unfolding while we believe we're in control? This is the point at which Nostradamus ceases to be merely a historical figure and becomes a mirror for our present. He provokes us to ask, are we living the life we choose, or merely repeating steps already inscribed in the spiral of time? Is what we call freedom merely an interval within a greater destiny? This restlessness, this discomfort in the face of the unknown, is precisely what keeps his name alive to this day. And don't think that Nostradamus' life was comfortable or easy. He paid a high price for daring to walk this threshold between science and prophecy. He lived through periods of persecution, faced the plague that took thousands of lives, lost his wife and children, was accused of witchcraft, and had to take refuge in different places to survive. However, none of this dimmed his desire to record what he saw. On the contrary, each tragedy seemed to deepen his vision even further, as if human pain were also a lens through which to see what lies ahead. Now imagine this man, alone in his candlelit room, writing at night, transforming hazy images into words that defy the centuries. Imagine him looking up at the sky and believing that there, in the invisible movements of the stars, lay answers no one wanted to hear. And ask yourself, if Nostradamus were alive today, what would he see in our world? Wars that never end, environmental crises, technology that simultaneously connects and isolates us, societies teetering between progress and chaos. Perhaps he wouldn't need to invent new verses, just repeat the old ones because the spiral continues. And it is at this point that the suspense heightens. Because among all its enigmas, there is one that stands out with almost unbearable intensity. The prophecy of the 3 days of darkness. Amid metaphors of fallen empires and defeated kings, this vision rises like an inverted beacon, not to guide, but to warn. 3 days in which the sun would go out, and the world would know a terrible silence. This is the moment when the past meets the present, and when its words cease to be mere mysterious literature and become a disturbing warning. The question that echoes is inevitable. Are we already approaching the point where the spiral closes and the announced darkness returns? Or could this omen not be about the heavens, but about us, about the way we live and destroy ourselves. Uncertainty is precisely what makes Nostradamus so timely, because he doesn't give us easy answers. He presents us with riddles, and riddles never grow old. At the end of this part of the journey, we are faced with a clear dilemma. Viewing Nostradamus as a charlatan is simple but dangerous. Seeing only coincidences in him is comfortable, but perhaps naive. Recognizing his work as a mirror of destiny, however, is a disturbing invitation. For if he truly read in the stars the cycles that still repeat themselves today, perhaps we are about to enter the shadow he described. And the great question that haunts us is, what exactly will happen when the prophet's words cease to be metaphor and become reality before our eyes? Among all the enigmas left by Nostradamus, there is one that looms large like an inescapable shadow: the prophecy of the 3 days of darkness. It is not merely a metaphor scattered in obscure verses, but an insistent vision repeated in different traditions and resurfacing like a disturbing echo in our collective memory. 3 days in which the sun will not rise, in which night will cease to be a fleeting relief and become sovereign over the earth. 3 days in which the very order of the universe will seem suspended, as if creation had been halted midway. When we imagine these days, we don't just speak of an absence of light. We speak of a cosmic void, a suffocating silence, an experience that would traverse not only the body but also the mind. What would happen to our sanity if the cycle of light and shadow were interrupted? We know that the human body depends on the sun to regulate its rhythms, but what about the soul? What would happen to faith, to bonds, to the notion of the future? The darkness would not only be physical, it would also be spiritual, psychological, and social. Nostradamus, in his writings, seemed to point to this total collapse, the extinction of the sun as a symbol of the extinction of everything we believe to be stable. What if this vision is more literal than we think? Many modern interpreters associate the 3 days of darkness with cosmic phenomena capable of radically altering life on Earth. Some speak of intense solar flares, capable of destroying our power grids and plunging us into technological darkness. Others mention colossal volcanic eruptions, similar to that of Tambora in 1815, which spewed enough ash to cause a year without summer. Still others point to asteroid impacts or sudden shifts in the Earth's magnetic field. Could these be the signs Nostradamus deciphered in the stars? Or did his symbolic language hide something even more disturbing, something we can't translate into science? Here's a pause. Why do so many different peoples, separated by oceans and centuries, speak of periods of cosmic darkness? The biblical apocalypse describes the sun going out. Ancient Egyptian texts recount nights when the Nile ran red and darkness enveloped the earth. Norse people spoke of Fimbulwinter, a devastating winter that would precede the end of time. Could they all share the same vision or simply respond to an ancient fear of the disappearance of light? What's more frightening, to think it's all just coincidence, or to consider that different cultures grasped the same inevitable fate? At the same time, Nostradamus doesn't just describe external darkness. He speaks of forces moving within this void, entities or energies that only manifest when the light recedes. Here, the mystery deepens. Were they metaphors for human fears that emerge in times of crisis, or was he hinting at real, invisible presences, waiting for the moment of darkness to walk among us? The warning is clear. Do not look outside during these days. But why not? What exactly is revealed when the light fades? Imagine this everyday scene. You're at home with your family, locked in, windows covered, trying to protect yourself. The clock ticks, but doesn't seem to move forward. Hunger, thirst, and fear build. Outside, a silence interrupted only by strange sounds. Perhaps footsteps, perhaps moans, perhaps nothing human. How do you keep your mind sane? How do you explain to a child that they can't look out the window, that they can't go outside? Because danger isn't something to be fought, but something to be avoided. It's not hard to see how this scenario, even symbolic, can shake any emotional foundation. Could you resist? This prophecy also raises another question. What if darkness is a watershed? Nostradamus spoke of profound consequences, as if after these 3 days, nothing would be the same. What would disappear with the night? What would be reborn with the dawn? Perhaps this is the most enigmatic point of all. Darkness would not be just punishment, but transition. A kind of collective test in which the entire world is forced to pass through a tunnel of silence to awaken differently. Is this a warning of destruction or a promise of renewal? But the most disturbing question is, why did Nostradamus leave this warning in such cryptic form? Why didn't he describe what he saw directly? Perhaps because enigma was the only way to survive in his time, amid the Inquisition and intolerance. Perhaps because certain visions cannot be translated into simple words, at the risk of losing their symbolic weight. Or perhaps because the future itself refuses to be revealed clearly, demanding that each generation read its signs and decide whether they are faced with myth or destiny. When we think about the present, it's impossible not to connect this omen to our own fears. We live dependent on artificial light, digital networks, and the energy that sustains our cities. A global blackout, even a temporary one, would be enough to trigger economic, social, and psychological collapse. Imagine 3 entire days of total darkness, without the internet, without communication, without the comfort of light. We don't need cosmic catastrophes for the prophecy to take shape. The fragility of our own creations would suffice. Did Nostradamus anticipate the collapse of our self-confidence? And here arises a final conflict that cannot be ignored. The prophecy speaks of universal darkness, but how do we deal with the idea that some may interpret it spiritually, while others see it as a physical threat? Which of the two is more dangerous? What could be more devastating? 3 days without sunlight, or 3 days in which humanity is forced to confront its deepest fears? Perhaps the true horror lies precisely in the uncertainty, because we don't know if the coming night will be of the sky or of the soul. Nostradamus never wrote to be immediately understood. He wrote to provoke, to awaken, to force generations to reflect on their own vulnerability. Today, when we reflect on the 3 days of darkness, we are not just dealing with an ancient vision, but with a mirror that reflects our modern anxieties. The silence, the darkness, the suspension of the natural order, all of this continues to challenge us, reminding us that no matter how much science advances, we still cannot control the most basic cycle, sunrise and sunset. In the end, the question remains, are the 3 days of darkness merely a symbol or a premonition? Are we faced with a metaphor for the need for transformation, or a real event approaching on the horizon? The suspense surrounding this prophecy is precisely what makes it so powerful, because whatever the answer, the feeling is the same. We are not prepared. And perhaps this is the lesson Nostradamus intended to impart, that no empire, no generation, no human being can consider themselves safe from the mystery of time. If the prophecy of 3 days of darkness sounds like an inevitable sentence, Nostradamus also left fragments of instructions on how to navigate it. In his verses, we find not only warnings about the terror of the night, but veiled recommendations, almost as if he wanted to hand over the key to resisting a period in which the very order of the world would be suspended. He spoke of sealed homes, of covered windows, of blessed candles that would remain lit when all others were extinguished. These images may seem symbolic at first glance, but they carry a disturbing power. What if they are not just metaphors, but survival manuals? Consider for a moment the psychological impact of living in a locked space for days without knowing what's happening outside. Current studies show that even temporary lockdowns, like those experienced during recent pandemics, have increased cases of anxiety and depression by more than 30%. If mere isolation already shakes the modern mind, imagine the effect multiplied by the absolute absence of light and the constant presence of silence. Nostradamus seems to have foreseen this human fragility, recommending not only physical supplies, but also spiritual practices. For him, traversing the darkness was not just a matter of material survival, but of inner resilience. The recommendation of sacred candles, for example, reappears in different religious traditions. In the Catholic Church, there are ancient records of blessed candles that remain unextinguished during storms or calamities, seen as symbols of divine protection. Interestingly, modern scientists have studied candles made with pure beeswax and found that they are more resistant to weathering and airborne impurities than ordinary candles. Coincidence or not, Nostradamus' advice gains weight when we cross the line between the symbolic and the practical. He seemed to say, "Prepare yourselves in body and spirit, for the test will be total." But it's not just the materiality of the instructions that's impressive. Nostradamus insists that people not look outside during darkness. This prohibition has always intrigued scholars. Was it simply a metaphor for not being consumed by collective fear? Or was he suggesting that something unimaginable would take shape in the void? Consider how curiosity is an essential part of our nature. We are driven to seek explanations, to try to see what is hidden. However, the warning is clear: looking is dangerous. Isn't this also true today, when constant exposure to images of tragedy, alarming news, and endless crises seems to erode our hope? Perhaps Nostradamus already sensed that not every truth should be faced directly, for there are secrets that destroy those who contemplate them. It's interesting to note how even in real situations of prolonged blackouts, society collapses. The Great Blackout of 2003, which left millions without power in the United States and Canada, resulted in immediate chaos, paralyzed public transportation, overwhelmed hospitals, looting in some cities. And all this happened in less than 2 days, in the midst of the technological age. Now imagine what 3 days without light, power, or communication would be like, coupled with an atmosphere of mystery and cosmic fear. Nostradamus wasn't just talking about distant prophecy, he was pointing to the very real vulnerability we carry to this day. Amidst all this, his emphasis on spiritual preparation takes on new meaning. The prophet advised constant prayer, fasting, and reading sacred texts, not as superstitious practices, but as ways to keep the mind focused and the heart resilient. Modern psychologists confirm that spiritual or meditative rituals significantly reduce stress levels in times of crisis. In other words, Nostradamus' advice, even shrouded in mystical language, maintains a direct connection with proven mechanisms of human resilience. He seemed to unite the invisible with the concrete, as if to say, you will need both faith and reason to cross the abyss. But how would we react today faced with such a scenario? We are so dependent on technology that even a few minutes without internet can generate collective anxiety. In 2021, when global social media networks were down for just 6 hours, millions of people reported feelings of isolation and loss of control. This episode, small compared to the prophecy, serves as a practical example. Collapse doesn't need to come from cosmic forces to become unbearable. It can arise from what we have built and believe to be safe. Nostradamus may have intuited this centuries earlier, showing that the greatest preparation is not only for the unknown in the sky, but for the unknown within us. What's most intriguing about this part of his visions is the instructional, almost paternal tone. He doesn't just frighten, he guides. It's as if he's saying, darkness will come, but there is a way to endure it. This detail sets him apart from other prophets who speak only of destruction and punishment. Nostradamus offers a thread of hope, however fragile, sustained by the idea of discipline, silence, and faith, as if he knew that humanity would only learn when confronted with the total absence of what it considers essential. This idea of refuge also leads us to reflect on the present. Where are our refugees today? How many of us would be able to remain in silence for 3 days, without light, without distractions, with only our thoughts and fears? The modern world seems to fear silence itself, filling every moment with stimuli. Perhaps the prophesied darkness is also a metaphor for a forced plunge into what we avoid daily, inner solitude. The greatest enemy may not be outside, but within each of us. What if this is the true test? If darkness is merely a curtain that reveals human frailty, the inability to face oneself. If the advice to close the windows is not just literal, but spiritual. Not to be distracted by the shadows outside, but to face the shadows within. Nostradamus's warning in this case would be not just physical survival, but psychological survival, a test of endurance in the face of the invisible. We then arrive at an inevitable question: how many of us would actually resist? In times of global crisis, statistics show that the increase in emotional disturbances and social breakdowns is exponential. If we've already wavered in the face of temporary blackouts, economic collapses and pandemics, how would we react to 3 days of absolute silence imposed by the cosmos itself? Nostradamus seems to suggest that it's not just about reacting, but about being prepared in advance. Because when night falls, it will already be too late to improvise. And here lies the final tension. What seems like mere practical advice is, in fact, a revelation about ourselves. Candles, prayers, silence, sealed homes, symbols of a humanity in need of rediscovering discipline and self-control. Perhaps preparation is simply a reminder that nothing is eternal, not even the light we believe is safe. And when that moment arrives, the only question remaining is, who will make it through the 3 days of darkness without getting lost in the void? This is the doubt that carries the weight of the omen and forces us to face the next revelation with even greater attention. When we read Nostradamus's visions of the 3 days of darkness, it's impossible to ignore the fact that we're not faced with an isolated prophecy. On the contrary, the echoes of this idea run through cultures, religions, and mythologies across the world, as if the same truth were being revealed by different voices throughout history. This convergence is what makes the omen so disturbing. If people who had never met described a similar scenario, were they all imagining the same illusion or witnessing a fragment of something real? The feeling is that we're faced with a universal enigma, a code repeated in different languages, but pointing to a common destiny. In Christianity, the Book of Revelation speaks of a time when the sun will be extinguished and the moon will turn to blood, foreshadowing a period of extreme trial. The prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament warned that the sun will be ashamed and the moon will be confounded, describing a cosmic collapse that would serve as a sign of humanity's judgment. Christian theology has always seen in these texts not only spiritual metaphors, but also the promise that natural light would give way to divine revelation. For many Bible scholars, the connection with Nostradamus is no mere coincidence. Both speak of a period when the world would be plunged into darkness and the true character of humanity would be revealed. But it's not just in the West that we find this echo. In Hindu traditions, the Vedas describe endless cycles of creation and destruction, known as yugas. The current cycle, called Kali Yuga, is portrayed as an age of degeneration, marked by the forgetting of the sacred and the corruption of the human spirit. At the end of this period, the texts say there will be a collapse, a night of darkness that will precede the rebirth of a new era of light. This cyclical logic, in which time does not move in a straight line but in spirals of repeating patterns, is strikingly similar to the vision of Nostradamus. The French prophet seemed to understand what the Hindu sages understood. Human destiny does not unfold in continuous progress, but in cycles of fall and renewal. The Mayans, in turn, constructed their calendar based on a cosmic vision of extraordinary precision. For them, history was marked by great eras that ended with cataclysms. In their codices and inscriptions, we find the idea of a period of darkness that would precede the transition to a new cycle. When their calendar came to an end in 2012, many interpreted this event as a harbinger of the end of the world. What actually happened was something more subtle. Not a literal end, but the awakening of a new awareness of the fragility of civilization. Still, the presence of darkness as a marker of transition remains a pattern that directly dialogues with the prophecies of Nostradamus. In Norse traditions, we find the narrative of Fimbulwinter, a long and devastating winter that preceded Ragnarok, the end of the gods and the established order. During this period, the sun would disappear for long days, and the world would be plunged into cold and darkness before the final battle. In ancient Egypt, accounts speak of nights when the earth was covered in total darkness, as if the gods had closed their eyes to humanity. These parallels are striking because they demonstrate that the idea of darkness is not exclusive to any one people or religion, but a collective archetype, a symbol that spans continents and centuries. This is where a provocative question arises. How can we explain this convergence? Are we dealing with a shared ancestral memory recorded in humanity's collective unconscious? Or did these descriptions arise from actual observations of cosmic phenomena that repeat themselves at long intervals? Eclipses, for example, have always aroused fear and apocalyptic interpretations. But no ordinary eclipse is capable of causing 3 days of total darkness. Could this then be the memory of a catastrophic event that occurred in the distant past, transmitted orally and transformed into myth by different peoples? Or is it an omen of something yet to come, awaiting the right moment in the spiral of time? The fact is that in our era, we also face signs that can be read as modern omens. The advancing climate crisis is already generating extreme events, and scientists warn that massive volcanic eruptions or solar flares could plunge entire regions into long-lasting blackouts. A 2019 study showed that a solar storm similar to the one recorded in 1859, known as the Carrington event, would be capable of paralyzing satellites, destroying power grids, and plunging continents into technological darkness. Could these not be the contemporary equivalents of the darkness described by the ancients? Perhaps Nostradamus was speaking not only of the physical sky, but also of human structures collapsing under their own weight. What's most intriguing is how all these narratives converge not only on darkness, but on the idea of judgment and transformation. Whether in the Christian apocalypse, the Hindu cycles, the Mayan eras, or Norse legends, night is not the definitive end, but a threshold, a test that separates those who resist from those who succumb, those who renew themselves from those who are lost. This same duality appears in Nostradamus. The 3 days of darkness are not only punishment, but also the promise of a purer dawn. Night, in this sense, is both threat and purification, and here lies the reflection that brings us even closer. What these traditions reveal is not only the fragility of the physical world, but the fragility of the human soul. Because whether darkness comes from the sky, the earth, or our own hands, it always exposes what we prefer to hide. Today, our own choices confront us with similar shadows, wars that repeat themselves, inequalities that widen, technologies that create new dependencies. Are we recreating, in a modern way, the same signs our ancestors interpreted as warnings? To what extent are we aware of the fact that history, like time described by Nostradamus, moves in spirals? This realization leads us to a greater concern. What if the convergence of these prophecies is not a coincidence, but a reminder that all paths lead to the same experience? 3 days of darkness as a universal metaphor for the moment when humanity must stop, face its flaws, and go through a cycle of transformation. If so, what matters most is not the form that darkness will take, but how we react when it arrives. Will we be able to learn from the mistakes of those who came before? Or will we repeat the pattern, blindly walking toward the next downfall? By uniting the voices of different civilizations, we realize that Nostradamus was not alone. He was part of a chorus that spans time, each culture adding its own note to the same dark melody. This melody accompanies us to this day, reminding us that the light may fail, but the cycle continues. And perhaps the great revelation lies precisely there. Regardless of the prophecy's origin, they all speak of the same essential truth, the need for rebirth. Night is inevitable, but it is also inevitable that at some point the dawn will return. What remains uncertain is who will be ready to welcome it. After traversing Nostradamus's visions, from universal shadows to survival instructions, we arrive at the most delicate and, at the same time, most hopeful point of the entire prophecy. The fourth day, the rebirth after absolute night. What does it mean, after all, to emerge from darkness? The prophet describes that after 3 days of darkness, a renewed light will emerge, purifying the world and transforming those who remain. This is not just an image of a physical dawn, but a powerful symbol of reconstruction. What remains after the ordeal is no longer the same as it was before. It is as if the collective soul itself has passed through a tunnel and, upon emerging, realizes that everything has changed. But this outcome raises the first major question: how many would be prepared for this new sun? How many would have resisted the pressure of the night, the fear, the loneliness, the temptation to look outside? Nostradamus doesn't clarify how many would survive, only stating that the price would be high. This confronts us with an uncomfortable truth. It's not just about waiting for the darkness to end, but about being ready for life after it. And herein lies the secret we can apply to our daily lives. Because everyone, at different points in their lives, goes through periods of darkness. They may not last 3 days, but they can last weeks, months, or years. They may not extinguish the sun, but they do extinguish our faith, our courage, our sense of purpose. The symbolism of prophecy is therefore a metaphor for human life. Each person experiences their own dark days, a painful loss, an unexpected failure, a betrayal, an illness, an inner emptiness. In these moments, time seems suspended and hope seems distant. But as the prophet warns, darkness is also a passage. It is not a definitive end, but a transition. And it is at this point that we can transform prophecy into practice, recognizing that periods of darkness are inevitable, but also necessary for a new light to emerge. So what should we do in the face of this revelation? How can we translate into action the teachings that have reached us through the centuries? The first practical step is to prepare. Just as Nostradamus advised candles, prayers, and silence, we can apply this concretely today. Preparing doesn't just mean stocking up on objects, but cultivating habits that strengthen the mind and heart. Setting aside moments of silence amidst the daily noise, learning to face solitude without fear, maintaining a spiritual or philosophical discipline that sustains balance when everything around us seems to be falling apart. The second step is to learn to close the windows to external noise. The advice to not look outside can be translated in the present as not allowing ourselves to be consumed by the avalanche of information, fears, and stimuli that distract and corrode us. In times of crisis, clarity comes from looking within, not without. This requires discipline to filter what we consume, to protect our mind and spirit. Each of us can start today by reducing excessive digital distractions, cultivating focus on reading or practices that expand consciousness rather than fragment it. The third step is to strengthen the inner flame. Just as blessed candles would withstand the weight of the night, we need to find our own sources of light that never go out. This could be faith, a personal purpose, or dedication to something greater than ourselves. The important thing is that it be real and resilient, not dependent on external circumstances. Ask yourself, what is the candle that illuminates my life even in the darkest moments? Discovering this answer is the key to enduring your own dark days. The fourth step is to live in community. Nostradamus spoke of families gathered together, of closed homes, of people protecting each other. This image reminds us that no one goes through darkness alone. Today, this means strengthening true bonds, cultivating deep friendships, offering and accepting support. In times of crisis, it is unity that sustains, not loneliness. How many times have you noticed that a word of support, a discreet presence, completely changed the way you faced a difficulty? Prophecy, in this sense, is also a call to reconnect with one another. The fifth step is to prepare for rebirth. It's not enough to resist the darkness. You must know what to do when the light returns. Often, we survive crises but fail to seize the opportunity to begin differently. Nostradamus seems to suggest that the world that emerges after the 3 days is not just a continuation, but a new chapter. So ask yourself, if tomorrow were the 4th day, what life would you choose to live? What would you leave behind? And what would you begin anew? This simple question can completely transform how we face our own periods of shadow. By applying these 5 steps, preparing ourselves internally, closing the windows of noise, strengthening the flame, living in community and preparing for rebirth, we transform prophecy into practice. We don't need to wait for a cosmic cataclysm to live with greater awareness, discipline and purpose. The truth is that the 3 days of darkness already exist within each of us, in moments of falling and silence. And the dawn that comes after is also always available, if we have the courage to cross the night. Nostradamus may never have simply wanted to frighten. Perhaps his intention was to provoke reflection, to teach through mystery, to encourage humanity to resist complacency. Because deep down, every prophecy is a mirror. And when we look into it, we see not only the distant future, but also the present we already carry. What you do with it is your choice. Darkness can be simply fear, or it can be the opportunity to awaken to a new consciousness. So as I conclude this journey, I invite you to reflect. What are your own 3 days of darkness? What have you been avoiding facing? And what will be your 4th day, your personal dawn? These questions may seem uncomfortable, but they are precisely what open the doors to transformation. If each of us applies these lessons to our daily lives, we will not only survive our nights, but learn to be born again, stronger and more lucid. And if this message touched you, if it provoked reflections you might never have otherwise considered, I ask that you don't let this experience die here. Subscribe to the Fate Forecast channel, like this video so it reaches more people, and share your questions, insights, or even your personal experiences in the comments, anonymously if you wish. Your voice is part of this community, and each story helps others realize they are not alone. Because in the end, true dawn arises when we walk together in search of meaning.